In June 2014, Nintendo announced that they would be releasing a new title into the Star Fox series, one that's been left mostly alone since the release of Command in 2006. Star Fox Zero would be the first game on a console in just about 10 years, so the premise of a new game left a lot of fans, including me, excited for a fleshed out experience on the Wii U. But Star Fox has always been in an awkward spot. It's a series that's always been open to experimentation, from touchscreen controls of Command to the spin-off title Adventures. Most of the series seem to have glaring problems with each title. So that begs the question, does Star Fox Zero break the mold? To start off, Zero's ad campaign seemed to push that this game was less of a remake of Star Fox 64, but rather a retelling. In the end, it's more or less the same, but with minor changes, the big change being the inclusion of wormholes at different times during the story. Honestly, these portals bring almost nothing to the table, and their inclusion feels like a lazy way to go about adding alternate routes, which the Star Fox series is known for. Looking back on it, these portals felt as nothing more than a tool to get Fox and other objects from point A to point B. But Star Fox has never really been about the story. It's more about being an arcadey, on-rails shooter with the added fluff of hearing banter from the teammates. A lot of Star Fox 64's appeal, at least to me, was that it put off this corny action movie vibe with the team's dynamic. Characters would react to someone getting damaged, accidental friendly fire, or the threats they faced, which Zero showed a disappointing lack of. But that's not to say this game wasn't creative, it just went too far with creativity sometimes. One of the cooler ideas in this game was that the gamepad, which sort of acts like a cockpit to the player, was used for team banter. It seemed like this could be a good means of immersing the player, but the gameplay rips you out of any immersion due to the control scheme. But I'll get to that later. It also doesn't help that the gamepad has a very short battery life, so having the volume maxed out means that you'll probably be plugging up your controller in your playtime. But the banter's still here, and it's still voiced by the original cast, even if it feels a little less often than previous games. As for the music, nothing really stood out to me, but nothing was inherently bad, just forgettable. The only time the music ever gave me any kind of feeling was when I used my Fox amiibo to transform the R-Wing into the SNES version of the ship, and it changed the sound effects and the music to match the original. Alternatively, the other amiibo that works with this game is Falco, which gives the player a black and red R-Wing that does more damage at the downside of taking more damage. It's a cool feature, but a hard mode in a game like this just wasn't fun, didn't pull me in, so I didn't really use it. Even though this game had some good ideas, this game's biggest shortcoming was the control scheme that they decided to go with. So if you're out of the loop, I'll run it down for you. The Wii U's gamepad is the only controller that you can use in this game single player because of its gyro capability and second screen. The player being forced into using one specific controller isn't really a big deal, but the problem lies in the game's design. For instance, Star Fox 64's remake for the 3DS, that had gyro controls, but it was optional, meaning that you could still get the experience of the original game on the remake. But for Star Fox Zero, the game was designed around the gamepad screen acting as a cockpit view, which is a cool idea, but when you put it to application, it drops the ball hard. So, a big part of Star Fox's gameplay as a rail shooter is maneuvering away from harm while shooting as much enemies as you can. But in Zero, you'll find yourself having to prioritize whether or not to use the gamepad or the main screen. This results in either the player running into fire on accident or missing shots. Ultimately, this mechanic brings gameplay from fun to a chore, resulting in a lot of moments of helplessness. And this is coming from someone who's a fan of Nintendo's more experimental games. Skyward Sword and Super Mario Galaxy are two of my favorites. I think it's hard to forgive awkward controls when Nintendo just pulled off gyro controls great with Splatoon. The difference being that Splatoon uses the completely optional, mind you, gyro as a tool for adding more precision, where Star Fox Zero uses it at the foundation of this game's controls. But unfortunately, the gyro and the gamepad aren't the only things bad about the gameplay here. Some of my minor nitpicks include some of the poor button mapping. So, the boost and the slow are both mapped to the right stick, and pushing forward or backwards to control speed feels natural, but the problem is that the ability to bank left or right is also on the right stick, which ended up making a lot of boosts look really funky. Additionally, the only way to barrel roll in this game is to flick the right stick twice in one direction, which makes one particular level really aggravating. And I know these are very minor details to get caught up on, but I feel sometimes a game's strongest suits can be found in the polish on certain things like these. Not counting the motion controls, this game tried to experiment with a lot of different modes of gameplay, but almost every single one fell flat. I didn't hate the gyro wing, but its slow gameplay doesn't belong here, if you ask me. The Landmaster returns and provides a good deviation on the gameplay on one of the better stages of the game. I actually found Titania to be one of my favorite stages due to the great visuals and being able to capture that feel this game deserved. Lastly, the Walker doesn't get any full stages to itself, but acts as a kind of addition to the R-Wing segments. But unfortunately, these all fall flat due to the wonky controls. The Walker feels slippery at times, and I never felt fully in control due to its speed and strange control method. One of the biggest letdowns of this game, in my opinion, is that every single boss fight is in all range mode, which is a ridiculous idea that seems to stem off the idea that the fights are supposed to look like these really scenic battles on screen, when in actuality the player has to use almost exclusively the gamepad. Looking back at 64, each boss had a distinct look and feel to them. Those bosses were about the threat the boss produced, and not about how cool Fox looked fighting them. So at this point, I want to talk about the final segment of the game for a little bit, so if you haven't played the game and don't want to be spoiled, skip to the timestamp I'm going to put on the video for you. Prior to the Andros fight, you're given a kind of recreation of the escape from Venom on Star Fox 64, but this time it's much different and in a much worse way. For instance, in 64, after defeating Andros, you escape the exploding ruins of Venom, assisted by the presumed ghost of your father, which makes for a really cool moment, leaving the player questioning if James is truly dead or if his ghost was just guiding Fox. The problem with Zero is that they do the same scenario, but while heading to Andros, which is fine, but the problem here is that there's no possible way of knowing the correct way without assistance. So unless the player's lucky, there's no way to traverse the maze on the first try. So after failing twice, James McCloud helps Fox navigate the maze, which makes for a cool parallel to the original game, but the problem here is that the game expects you to fail at least twice, which rips you out of any possible immersion you might have had at this point. So in the end, all of this serves as is good scenery to hype you up for the final fight. So the final boss, Andros, pulls out literally every problem I have with this game all at once. The game specifically references the gamepad for one segment of the fight, ruining whatever shred of immersion might have been left after the previous segment. So the fight assumes you can dodge these lasers with no real indicator of where you lie in this 3D space, because the cockpit gives you a backdrop of dark red and nothing else. The rest of the fight is your usual dodge and shoot, but there's two glaring issues I found with the chicken walker phase of this fight. The first being Andros has this move that puts his hand above the player, requiring you to aim up for the first time in this entire game, which is a strange decision, but, you know, whatever. Maybe I'm nitpicking. The other problem is when he pulls you with what I'm assuming is an unavoidable tractor beam, and you manage to break free, you're put into a free fall as the chicken form into the pit under Andros. When you get to a certain point here, you're going to automatically change into the R-Wing mode, giving you very little room to maneuver out of this pit, which is ridiculous that this even got past testing in my opinion. But the Andros fight is the first time in a long while I felt I had no control over my actions, resulting in maybe one of the worst boss fights I've ever dealt with. This game is at its best when it's just plain Star Fox with no gimmicks, but in a game of only a couple of hours of content, there's very little of that, which leads me to the topic of replayability. A lot of people have a problem buying a game like this due to its nature of being a game that can be beaten in a couple of hours. But the original games took notice to that and designed games to be a different experience on most playthroughs. There were paths that resulted from failure to complete a task on time and paths that completed from doing an impressive task. Star Fox 64 and the SNES game both came out in a time before everyone was plugged into the internet, and that left a lot of value in discovering alternate routes on your own. But the new game has exactly one planet that comes from an alternate route, and that route's only available after clearing the game for the first time. In Star Fox 64, the alternate path of Corneria, the first level, was caused by flying through a line of rock arches. Definitely something a player wouldn't achieve on his first playthrough, but it leads to a completely different boss battle. In Star Fox Zero, the option is to step on a button, but even if it was just a button, that wouldn't really be a huge deal. The problem here is that you can't step on that button until you've gotten to a certain point of the game where you've unlocked the ability to transform into the Chicken Walker. So what we're left with is this linearity that disguises itself as replayability, which feels like a failed understanding of the replayability that made the original game stand out as much as they did. All in all, Star Fox Zero was a massive disappointment to me, because this game obviously shows that the team could have made a great Star Fox game. The base of a great game is there, but I feel like the gimmicks that this game had ruined whatever chance there was to stand out. It hurts me to say that if any other company made this game, it would be considered shovelware and forgotten after a couple months. My recommendation is to try the controls before buying, but if you want a proper Star Fox game, just go back to 64 and SNES.